from a compilation of articles by Rabbi Michael-ben-Pesach Portnaar, How I Did Not Become a Traditional Rabbi. In 1967, I moved to Moscow from the Urals, where I lived. And somewhere in June-July 1973, I graduated and became an engineer for automation engineering, specializing in robots, manipulators, etc. I passed the second and third years of my studies within a year and graduated with honors. My scientific manager at the time was the world-renowned professor Boguslavsky, who invited me to stay in graduate school. He immediately offered me a position of a junior researcher to write a dissertation on the subject, which he was evolving. My future as a scientist was bright. But by the autumn of that year, I suddenly did something very stupid, in the opinion of my friends, family, relatives, Professor Boguslavsky, and all the others who knew me, as I officially went to study in a Jewish seminary at the main synagogue of Moscow City, in the Arkhipov Street. A bursary in the seminary was then insignificantly small, about 10 rubles per month. In order to become a student, it was necessary to pass a special screening by the Ministry of Religious Affairs, after which I was officially enrolled as a student at the seminary. I grew up in a simple religious Jewish family, but my parents did not teach me to read and write Hebrew. And so now, becoming a student of the seminary, I quickly began to study Hebrew, prayers, the Talmud, etc. In my group, I also studied Rabbi Eliyahu Esas, or simply Ilya. He is now one of the most famous and leading Orthodox rabbis, and he lives in Jerusalem. However, he's well known for his ardent hatred for and intolerance of Kabbalah. Meanwhile, the young Shayevich, who was formerly the chief rabbi of Russia and now perhaps the chief rabbi of Moscow, has already been studying for a year and a half in yeshiva in Budapest to get smicha, the diploma and title of rabbi. And so after 3 or 4 months of study at the seminary, I became one of the best and promising students. Then, during my studies in the seminary, the chief rabbi of the USSR was Mr. Fisher, a good-natured but Torah illiterate Jew. And before him it was Rabbi Levin. He was a Talmid Chacham, a Torah scholar. In the daytime, I studied under the great Mr. Gurevich, and the evenings, the nights separately, from all, secretly, I also studied under the great Tzaddik and Talmid Chacham Rabbi Miller, the last of the Mohicans, one of the greatest scholars of the Torah and Talmud in Russia. At that time, he already served a sentence of 10 years in Siberia for teaching the Holy Scriptures. After all, unauthorized teaching the Holy Language and the Torah was then, in 1973 to 1975, strictly prohibited and relentlessly pursued in the Soviet law. Curious is the fact that students were also punished for studying in such illegal form. And so, at the time, there already were concrete plans to send first Ilya Esas to study in the yeshiva in Budapest, with the purpose of becoming a rabbi. There already was a chronic shortage of skilled rabbis throughout the Soviet Union. But in the spring of 1974, Ilya suddenly gets thrown out of yeshiva. As it turned out, that he's a refusnik who participated also in demonstration and protest of the obstacles to leave the USSR for Israel. Then the Jewish synagogue leadership turned its gaze at me and at Yaakov Riklin. In a couple of years, he left to the U.S. We were being intensely prepared for the departure to Budapest, so we could study there to become a rabbi. With a lovely outlook towards the very near future, as just in a couple of years of study, and with my devotion, obviously even quicker, to become a respected rabbi, if not in Moscow, then certainly in a major city of Russia or in a capital of some Union Republic. Future of a major religious official was shining brightly towards me. But for the holiday of Shavuot, suddenly arrives in Moscow the world-famous Rav Tzitz from New Jersey, USA. And he, oddly enough, has a request for me. It turns out that his aunt lived in a city in Ural, where I came from to Moscow, etc. So then he asked me to give something to her. I do not even remember what it was. So was the need from above. Then, on the day of Shavuot, which coincided with the Shabbat, after the service in the main synagogue in the Arkhipov Street, there, in front of the synagogue, stood a crowd of people, of whom were protesters, refuseniks, as they were denied permission to leave for Israel, the family members or sympathizers. Meanwhile, the inside and outside of the premises was swarming with KGB agents. Rav Tzitz leaves the synagogue with me and leads me to the Hotel National, opposite the Kremlin, where he was staying, while I am, like a lamb, do not resist to go with him. And so after a brief stay in his room, I went out to go home, when suddenly a man approached me and inquired about Rabbi Tzitz. He was a KGB agent. What do you think? Why did Rabbi Tzitz come here? And other similar questions. It was followed by, we were very much encouraged you to cooperate with us in transfer of any information that may be of interest to us. By nature, I'm not a hero, so starting with the very next day, I stopped going to the synagogue and the seminary, but sent instead my mother there in order to tell the Jewish leadership that I have to leave the seminary due to health reasons. However, in the evenings and nights, I continued to study individually with Rabbi Miller and Gurevich. That's how I was saved then from the unclean powers, to become later a spiritual rabbi in the Lurian Kabbalah.